Hello and welcome to this introduction to the Microsoft Visual Studio environment. In this video, I'll be looking at the environment known as the IDE, what you can do, what are the toolbox items, some of them, what are some of the properties, some of the Solution Explorer, just to give you a basic introduction when you actually download Visual Studio for the first time, just to give you a bit of a rundown of where to go and what to do so you understand a little bit of how the IDE works. So this video is intended for really beginners, for people who's first time downloading Visual Studio who hasn't had any experience or so within the environment. Okay, so like I said, I use the Microsoft Visual Studio 2019 version. If you don't have that, please go and download it now. There is a free community version which you can get from Microsoft. Just check in the Google bar here. You can search for Microsoft Visual Studio download. It will open up the first one. You can click on it. First link there. There are a few versions there, which is the current Visual Studio 20 or the latest Visual Studio Visual Studio version. What you want to do is to download the community version. It is free. And it is basically for users who are students or learning or something in that scenario. So you can go and download it and install that so long. You might need to have a Microsoft account in order to get the version downloaded and set up correctly. Okay. Once you have done that and it is set up correctly, you'll need to open it up, and that's where I will start with the environment itself. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my Visual Studio 2019. Okay, so just a bit of a rundown on Visual Studio, what it is. It's Visual Studio is a product that is built by Microsoft. It has a lot of versions before that, and the Microsoft Visual Studio .NET framework was really started working in 2002 when they released the 2012 version. Before that, there were other versions of it, including Visual Basics, which was not a fully object-oriented programming language, and it had a difficulty when you did some programming. It obviously did the job back in the day, but as technology improved, Microsoft came up with the .NET framework. So the Microsoft Visual Studio is an integrated development environment. So when you hear guys talk about the IDE, or it is an IDE type of platform, it is a integrated development environment, which in a nutshell, it's a design environment where you can do certain things. So what do you do in the end of the day? You are writing programs that you can install, or that can be installed or used in a website or web application environment. So you can build Windows desktop applications. You can build websites, web apps, web services, mobile apps even, various types of programs that you can build using the Visual Studio platform. All right, so for this scenario, we are going to open up a Windows desktop application. We're not going to write any code. We are just going to play around with the environment, play around with the toolbox, play around a little bit with some of the properties, just so you can understand what some of the things mean within the environment. So the first time you open up your Visual Studio, you will, if it is the 2019 version, like I have here, you will see that there is an Open Recent section on the left-hand side. There is also a Get Started on the right-hand side. The Open Recent is obviously projects that you have been working on in the past, easily accessible. And then over here, we're going to jump into a new project. Okay, so for the first one, click on the Create a New Project. You'll see it'll open up a different screen where you can go and select the project type. Now, if you look at these three drop downs here, you'll see various options. So the first one is your language. Okay, now I'm not going to jump too much in on what a language is, but basically a language is like any other language. A language, when you speak English, for argument's sake, that is a language, and when you program in something, that is a language. So I prefer working in the the C# environment. When I use Visual Studio, there's obviously other few ones here that you can use. So I'm going to jump into C#, which is the one I'll be using. I'm going to look at a Windows platform. So the first one is the languages. Second one is the platform. What platform are you working in? So a platform, which type of OS are you going to be running it on? Where do you want to build this application for which type of platform? So we're going to stick to the basic one, which is Windows. And what type of platform are you going to be building? And we're going to build a desktop. So there's different types of platform where you want what type of project you're going to be building within that type of platform. So we're going to stick to desktop. All right, so if you obviously change, you'll see whatever different scenario you're selecting here, you'll have different options that are popping out. So on desktop, I've got all of these options that are popping out. You might not see all of them. You might see some of them. Some of them I have installed as extensions. Some of them is added stuff which you might not have. So what you would be looking for in your list is Windows Forms app. That's what you'd be looking for. If you cannot find it, you can also type in here Windows Forms, and then you'll start highlighting what you want. Okay, and you can see that there is a Windows 4 app.NET Core, and I'm not going to run too much an explanation on what the difference is between the framework and the core. For this video, we're making it very simple. We're sticking to the .NET framework, so you can click on that. You can either click on the next button or double click the item there. All right, so your next screen is basically a project name. Your project name is obviously for you to understand what you have created. So it needs to be meaningful to what the project is going to be doing. Don't give it a name that in a month's time you actually won't know what that project is doing when you look at the name. So give it something that is meaningful when you do create your project. So for this one, I'm going to create intro to VS IDE. So just to give you a bit of a introduction of it, so you can just create a name, any name that you feel comfortable with. Select the location, basically where you are going to save this project to. Don't worry too much with the solution name, and don't worry too much about the framework. The framework is the different framework version that we are busy with, or whichever version of framework you select to build it in. So 2019 currently is the framework version. There's a version before that, as and when Microsoft released different either service packs or versions of Visual Studio. All right, so I'm going to go and create this. All right, so what you'll see here is the environment, which is the Visual Studio environment. All right, so the environment, when you first install Visual Studio, as a default look, it will look similar to something like this. There is different environment options that you can select. You can change this black looking or gray, dark gray looking to a different feel. There's different colors that you can set up, and we'll look at some of those. So let's jump into what the environment does. So don't be too alarmed by this environment that you're seeing for the first time. It will all make sense as you practice and using it a lot more. The saying goes, practice makes perfect. So it is a good idea to, if you want to get into programming, to practice as often as you can and understand the environment. It is a big environment. There's a lot of stuff going on here. Some stuff you will not use, some stuff you will use, some stuff is there to make your life a bit easier, and so on. I myself don't use every single thing in the environment. I use specific core things that I would use, but that is because my day-to-day job would require me to use their specific items and not some of the other items within the environment. Okay, so before we look at the design section here, I want to look at some of the panes on this right hand side. So here you have Solution Explorer. There's a tab view at the bottom. You may or may not have, depending on what's been set up, and you will have a properties bar at the left and on the right hand bottom side. So if you haven't seen a system with this type of panels, if you would call it, so take a note of these options here. So I can go and hide, for argument, one of those panes, and then it will be gone. So my Solution Explorer, if you look here, it is here on the right hand side. If I hover or click on it here, it will come out again. If I click on the auto hide, it will either dock it or it will hide it. So this is called a little pin, so you can dock something or undock it, hide it or unhide it, that type of scenario. So if I grab it on here where it says this title bar here, if I grab it on here and I drag it, what you would notice is that there are different options that are popping up. There's an option there, there's an option there. These are docking options where I can go and dock this. Okay, so you can go and dock it there, dock it full here, depending on where you can dock it over here, and so on and so on. Different places where you can dock it. I prefer mine on the right hand side. I've always used it on the right hand side. So I'm going to go ahead and dock it back in here. And here's my Solution Explorer here. So just to give you an scenario, if I had to go and dock it in the center here, my Solution Explorer all of a sudden is here on top. So if you can see here, here's my Solution Explorer, here's everything that I need, depending on how you want to set up your environment. So this is all it's custom to what you want to see when you're using your Visual Studio environment. So it's purely up to you how you set it up. So I'm going to go back, drag it. So remember, you just click on it on top of the name, drag it, hold your mouse down, drag it, and pop it where you want to take it. So I'm going to put it back on top here, and feel free to play around with it. You can't break it, so just play around with it. If you close it by accident, so let's say I closed it, you played around, and by accident you closed it, it's gone now, nowhere to be seen. You can go and get all of the windows from your view section. So you'll see if I click on the view menu, there is a Solution Explorer, which has also got a shortcut key, Control Alt L. If I click on it, it will come back to the last place where before I closed it. So I'm going to take it back and pop it on there. So I'm going to dock it. So I remember the term docking. You can dock it or undock it. I can also hide this specific panel here. So I can hide it. If I hide it, it's there. I can also hide this properties panel. And now it's pretty much clear. There's nothing here. So you can click on it, depending on how you want to do it. So it really depends on yourself how you want to set it up. Sometimes I leave it like this, depending on how big I need to develop or the screen design needs to be, and I want to see my screen close to its full size. There's also various things that you can do within the window itself, and we'll discuss that. So I'm going to just go back ahead. So if you can look at here, I'll pin it back. I'm going to take that one and pin it back. Remember, you can close it. If you close it, it's gone, and you'll have to go to view and get it from the list here. Okay, so within this introduction, we're not going to cover necessarily every single thing in the environment. We're going to go over the basics so that if you had to start up your Visual Studio for the first time, you will be able to get around and understand more or less what's going on. Okay, so let's look at the Solution Explorer in a bit more detail. So the Solution Explorer, it's got a few things up here which you will use from time to time. Your main section here is basically what's going on within your project. So if you've added stuff in your project, that will appear here. Okay, so I'm not going to jump into what is properties and references and app config and so on. What you need to know is when you're adding stuff to your project, you can find it in your Solution Explorer. All right, and I'll demonstrate that in a second. So if you look at Form 1, Form 1 is also this is the actual form that we're working on. So remember, Windows desktop application uses forms. So a form is basically a screen where you'll develop stuff, where you'll do stuff to interact with the user. Okay, so it's going to be a screen at the end of the day, and we'll call it a form. So if I close all of these tabs on top here, so let me close every one of them. So I have a very blank looking screen. I've got nothing, and I want to open up my form. I would double click on it, and there's my form back. This is my design side of my form, and this is where I would do design items like buttons and text boxes and certain things that the user would use to interact in order to do what they need to do and accomplish within the system. So I'm going to show that again. Just close it, and if I double click it, it's there. So everything in your solution or added to your Solution Explorer within your project will be here, and you can have multiple different projects within the solution. So if I drop that down, so what you take note is my solution is Intro to VS IDE. That's my solution name, and my project, the only project I have within the solution, is called Intro to VS IDE. You can have as many projects as you want within the solution, and this is something that you'll learn at a later stage. Why would you want to have multiple projects and so on? So because it's you want to try and build these different layers within your application, it's a good idea to have these different projects that make up these layers, and it's something you'll learn at a later stage if you get into more programming. What is a data layer, what is a business layer, and an application layer, and so on and so on. It just makes it easier for the next developer to understand what's going on, where to go, and so on within the Solution Explorer. So within the project itself, if I drop that down, I have various types of things that I can use. Properties of the project, references, config, which is a configuration file, and then forms that I have there. So and then there's this last.cs file, which is the program file which every Windows desktop will have on the C# side. Okay, so if you look at this, I can go and add another form. So if I right click on this project, okay, so always check where you're right clicking. If I'm going to right click here, I'm going to then be talking about projects on this level here. I'm going to be talking about projects level. If I'm going to be wanting to right click on here, I'm going to talk about items within my project. So to demonstrate that, so you don't get a bit confused about it, if I right click here and I go add, I get add projects, add a new project, add an existing project, okay, which is project that I can add extra projects within my Solution Explorer. If I go here and I go add, I don't get that add extra project, I just get add new item. Okay, so if I go add new item and I go and add a Windows form, so again, there's a whole lot of selections. Don't worry too much about it at this stage. This is very much introduction. You're not going to understand everything in here necessarily. So I'm going to click on Windows Forms and I'm going to click Form here. Okay, and you'll see if I click on it, it's got a name there at the bottom, Form 2. My current one is Form 1. Now, I will, on the next video, when we're actually doing a little bit more, we will talk about naming conventions and how to name certain things. Specifically controls and forms and so on. You do not want to have in a project something that's called Form 2 or Form 1. You want to call it something that makes sense. It's basically what the form is about, a very short description of it. And so that the next developer that comes and works on the project can easily try and understand what is actually going on, what the form means. By that. So to give you an example, if I had to create an address book and one of my forms is to create a new person in my address book, I would maybe call my form address or create new or manage persons or manage addresses or create new address, that type of thing. It needs to make sense at the end of the day, so give it a name that makes sense to use, and also that the next developer can understand it. So for this example, I'm going to leave it as Form 2. I'm not really going to change it. I'm going to add what you will see all of a sudden in my Solution Explorer. I've got now Form 1 and I've got Form 2. Okay, and on my left hand side, my design side, I've got Form 2, Form 1. If I close them and have absolutely nothing open again, I will have Form 1, Form 2. I can click on Form 2, you'll see it opens up Form 2 design, and I can click on Form 1, it'll open Form 1 design. All right. This is basically what the Solution Explorer does. I'm not going to jump too much more into it. It is a place where you can find items within your solution. All right, there's a search function. So let's say I've got a lot of forms, I've got a lot of projects. I'm not sure what I'm looking for. I have an idea what it's called. I can go and type in the name, form 1, and it will highlight anything that is basically what I'm looking for. So I'm double click it again, and there it will be form 1. Okay. All right, so last thing I want to just show you on the Solution Explorer is the code section, the code behind. If you look at this form here, this is a design form. Okay, it can't do much. I can't move it around. This is a screen that the user would see if I had to play the system. That's basically it. This little section here is what the user would see. I can make it bigger, I can make it smaller. I can do certain things with the specific form, but ultimately when I play the system, whatever's on that form at that point, that's what the user will see. Okay. Now, behind every form is code. Code is what makes it work at the end of the day. I'm not going to jump into too much detail behind it, just so that you understand. I'm going to go into the code just so you can see it, but don't worry too much about it at this stage. So if you right click on the form 1.cs here, you will see there is a view code. Okay, so that's an F7 shortcut, and that's the other thing that you need to take note of. If you want to be a really good programmer, the shortcut keys within Visual Studio or with any environment that you're working in will really benefit you. So you need to learn the shortcut keys, use them so that it will make your programming day-to-day activity a lot easier. Okay, so normally if I was on here, I would press F7. I wouldn't go and right click and view code. I would press F7 and it'll take me to code. So for this example, I'm going to do this. I'm going to click on here, view code, and it takes me to a code section. Okay, with the code behind the form. So if you see up here, I now have a form1.cs and I have a form1.cs design. Design is my form section. .cs is my code section. Okay, so what does the CS stand for? It stands for C#. If you remember earlier, I said I'm going to write this program in a C# environment. So C# is basically the CS. If I written it in a Visual Basic environment, it would have been .vb. So depending on which language is, that's how the files are created within the environment. All right, so don't worry about what this means. Just know that obviously this is a code section. This is where we're going to write code so that when the user does an action or an event, something will fire in the code, which will then do something for the user. That will be the end result of it. So I'm going to close that. I'm just going to jump back here. This is where we are on the design of form 1. I'm going to close form 2 so it doesn't give confusion. All right, so if you're not sure where we are, just make sure you double click on form 1 and it will open up your design. All right, so this is Solution Explorer. A lot to it to still talk about, but I think we've covered a bit of the basics. I now want to just look at some of the, before we do properties, because properties directly link to your form design and your toolbox and so on. We won't jump into there. We'll come back to properties. I want you just to take note of the toolbox up here. There's a few things that might look familiar, like save. It's basically saving your form, saving everything that's not saved within your project. There's an undo, a redo button. There's also a start button, which is basically playing your program, playing it to see how it'll look. And for this, we can do that very simply. If I click on start here, Visual Studio will build your project, and it'll build any projects it can find within the solution. And if you look here, this here, I can move it now. It's because I'm in play mode. This form here is this form here. Okay, so to show it to you again, this form here is this form here. There's nothing on this form. It doesn't do anything. It's just a form that we currently played. Okay, it doesn't do anything. It's got standard stuff: minimize, maximize, and close. If I maximize it, I'm up there. I can minimize, I can restore it back to its original point up here, and so it does nothing at this point. It is a blank screen. If I close it, before I close it, actually, let me show you what happens in your environment. So back in your environment, you've now got where we previously had a start button. If you remember the start button, we now have a pause, which is a break all. We have a stop and we have a restart. Okay, 3 extra buttons came into play as soon as you started the program. So I'm going to go back here. Please look at what happens with this now when I close it. So I close it there, and those 3 buttons go away and my start is back. I click on start again, those 3 buttons come into play and my program has been launched. Okay, now I'm going to close it here. Okay, so that is something you'll use often, obviously, to test your program. The shortcut for this is F5. There are other shortcuts that also start your program, but for now, just know about F5 that starts it. These 2 drop downs here, don't worry too much about what the debug and release is and what CPU type you're using and so on. For now, just know about the start, know about saving, know about undoing, and these that I discussed here are all shortcuts. You need to know your Control S. You need to know Control Shift S, which saves everything. You need to know F5. You need to know what is an undo, Control Z, and a redo, Control Y. Basic standard Windows keyboard functions that is set up within the Visual Studio environment, and it's important to know these shortcuts, which will make your life a lot easier as you start programming. All right, so on top here we have the menu bar. I'm not going to jump in too much of the menu bar. You have your general file edit view, and then project information, where you can do certain things. There's building your solution. Again, various options within the building scenario. There's the debug. If you look here under debug, there you've got a F5, which is the start one. Same, if I click it, it does exactly the same as the previous button we did here. So basically this is an easier way to get to it. If you're on here, it's an easier way to start your program, but you could also go to debug and click on debug, start debugging. Okay, and there's various options in there. We're not going to worry about team projects. Formatting is something we can discuss that helps you in your designing of your form. These are tests runs that we're not going to be worried about. Analysis tools. Also, we won't worry too much about tools. A lot of stuff you can do within here. Extension items is basically items that third-party companies designed. Say, for argument, a extension that you can plug into Visual Studio that you can add into your program. Like I have an extension here, Telerik, and they build a different type of controls that makes your life a little bit easier, specifically for agile development. They help quite a bit. So if I'm using them in my Visual Studio environment, but you get lots of different extensions. All right, and then the window is basically how you're seeing your design. There's different options that you can do within this section. If I go to float, look at what happens to my window. It becomes a floating window instead of being fixed within the IDE itself. I'm not too much of a fan of this window, but it does at some scenarios for me it comes into play, and it's personal preference, so don't worry too much. It really depends on how you want to do it. So I'm going to go and I'm docking that thing back to where it is. So your window has different options of how you want to see it, manage your layouts, reset your window layouts, because you could have lots of different windows on top of windows and so on and so on. All right, so that's basically your menu. On the left-hand side, you have a few more of these panels or panes that basically come in and out where you can hide and dock them and so on. Remember, if I drag it, I can do something with it. I can put it back, depending on your scenario. Okay, so I'm not going to worry too much about Report Explorer, Data Explorer, or Survey Explorer. We're not going to discuss those. What we will be looking at is your toolbox. I'm going to dock this so you can see it. Your toolbox are controls that you need or require on this form in order to do something. All right. And we're going to come back to this in a second, but just know that your toolbox, there's a whole lot of different controls. and you can take this control, put it on the form, and do something with it. And we're going to do that in a second, just so that you can see how the environment works. Before we go that route, I just want to discuss what happens here at the bottom, and then we'll jump into the design of the toolbox, and then back to the properties. So inside the bottom section here, you have an error list and an output list. All right, so I'm just going to clear this so I can show you what happens. If I click on, and I'm going to dock this as well at the bottom here, so now you can see it's not hidden. So this currently is my output window. If I click on Start, Visual Studio will build, let me get it back here. Let me dock that on run mode. So Visual Studio will build a number of things, and it will give you things that it's not happy with, warnings or errors or something like that. Now, it will show it to you in your output window. Okay, so if I stop that, just take note, there's obviously a bit more options when you're in play mode. And when I stop it, I've got currently error list and output and web publish activity. So if I click on it, I'm going to clear this again. Let's see if we can see that. You can see that running there. It just ran these things. It played the system. So the form is here at the bottom. If you see this little icon here, that is a standard icon when you don't have anything set on your form. And if I click on it, there's my form. Okay, and if I close it again, I'm back in my Visual Studio, and here is my output window. Your output window is something that you'll use quite often. It's very handy. It will help you to determine if something is wrong, because that's where Visual Studio outputs certain things about your project. Could be errors, could be warnings, it could be how it's building it, where it is busy in the process, and so on and so on. The other one that you need to take note of is the error list, the tab for the error list. So the error list will show you something what your system is, or the system, this specific project is not happy with. So Visual Studio tried to maybe build your project and it failed it, and it'll try and give you a reason as why it failed. Okay, if you look up here, you've got errors, warnings, and messages. Errors, your system won't build. You can obviously force it to build, but it won't work, so don't bother doing that. Rather fix the error and move along. Warnings would be something like you wrote a piece of code and it was never used. Okay, so it might give you a warning and say, well, you've got some unused code, or a variable that you've declared that's not used, or something that's it's not an issue per se that it's not going to build. It will run, it will do what it needs to do, but you might have something that will not be used, unnecessary code type of thing. All right, so these are you mainly need to worry about errors at this point in time. So if you look at this, I can switch on what I want to see in this. As soon as I build an error, it will come up here, or a warning. Okay, so, and I'll show it to you just so you can see what I mean by that. So just give me a second. I'm going to go up and write some quick line of code just so that you can see how that works. Okay, I've written something very, very quickly. All I went into code and I just said int I. Don't worry about what it means. It's just to give you an example of what's happening. Immediately, you'll see the variable I declared is never used. Okay, so if I go back to my design, this is what you're going to be seeing. It just tells me, look, you've got something that's not used. Okay, I wrote something, I haven't used it. So I can then go and say, okay, I don't really care about warnings and I don't really care about messages. Not really a good idea. You want to try and have a clean solution. You want to try and have as much of your warnings gone as possible. Not always possible, but you want to try and get rid of as much as you can. So for this example, I'm not going to show my warnings. I'm going to just, so you can see this little blue line around a little border. If I unclick it, it's gone. I don't see it. Same with errors. I don't have any errors, and I'll create an error quickly so that you can see. So let's do this. Okay, I wrote something that the Visual Studio does not recognize, and all of a sudden I've got an error. Okay, if I take out that error, it will show 0 out of 1 error. I'm not seeing it, so it's not a good idea. You want to know what your errors are. You want to see so you can fix it. If I try and build my system, start, it will say, look, I'm not happy with what I'm trying to build. You can continue and run the last successful build, or you can stop it. So you probably don't want to run the last successful build because it's not going to give you the output that you're expecting if you've changed something in your code and so on. So generally you click on the no and then go and double click on it and fix the error. So I'm just going to take that out for the time being, and I'll take the error away and it's gone. So I like keeping errors highlighted always so I can see what's going on. And in some instances I'll also use the warning messages that pop in. So very important. Keep an eye on that. That will help us to determine if there's a problem within your solution or your projects and within the environments. All right, let's jump back to I'm going to just hide that again. Jump back to our design. Okay, so like I said, your toolbox is a key factor within your design. It helps you to do certain things, to build or different controls to add to your form so that you can build an action or an event for the user. So for this example, we're not going to write any code, but we're going to do just add a few controls so you can see what I mean. So I'm going to go and I'm going to add a label, very basic control. Label, I'm going to drag it to look at the action that I'm doing here. I've got it highlighted what I want and I can drag it. Can you see my on this design? If I go out of it, all right, it still has that little box, okay, but if I leave it, it's not there, it's not loaded. So when you do it again, if I drop it on there, you can see the plus sign. If I go out, it's actually not going to drop it. So if I go here and I drop it, there's my label. Okay, and I can move this control within my environment. I can't move it outside my environment. I can move it within my form, which is my current environment. I can make my form bigger and I can move it further around. Okay. So I've got a label. Okay. There's a lot of controls here. We're not going to go through every single control. I'm going to show you the probably one or two or three of the basic controls that I want to work with. So I've got a label. I also want a text box. Okay, I'm going to pop my text box on there, and I also want a button. Okay, the other thing is you don't necessarily have to drag it. You can also double click it. So if I double click it, it always puts it on the left hand top corner, and then you can go and drag it, whatever scenario you feel comfortable with. I prefer dragging it because I'm going to put it somewhere on the form, so I might as well drag it already and put it where I want it. But you can double click it and it will pop it in. So if you can see, I just double click it and it puts it where your mouse cursor was last at. So if you can see, if my mouse cursor, let's say I move this checkbox here, that's where my mouse cursor is last at. If I double click it, it'll put it over there. Okay, so depending on how you want to do it. But you just go put it on and then you can then select anything. Remember, I'm still in design. So I'm not running, I'm in design. You can see the little selection boxes here, which makes it bigger or smaller of the form itself. So I'm in design and I can click on any of these controls that I've put on my form. So I can click on it. You can see again, it makes these little boxes around it, which means I've selected it. Okay, and they can be dragged around and dropped where you want to put them. They can be made, some controls can be made longer. Some controls height can change, width can change, and so on and so on. Some controls are on auto settings, which means that as the text goes bigger, so the control size goes bigger, depending on what you want to do. And you can change those settings in the properties. All right, so I've got my label, I've got my text box, I've got a nice long text box, and I've got a button. Okay, so I'm going to make the form a little bit smaller. Okay, because there's not much going on there. And I'm now going to play my program. Remember the shortcut key that I said earlier? Use F5. So I press F5, or you can click on the start. And I'm going to just minimize Visual Studio so you can see what I'm looking at. Oops, sorry. You can see what I'm looking at. This is my form that I currently have. I'm going to minimize that as well. Sorry, let me close all that. And you can see this is the form. This is what we've built. Now, if I am a user and you give me this form to use, I'm going to tell you what am I supposed to do with this, because I have no idea what it's supposed to do. But if I change the text and I start giving you a bit more information, then that would make more sense to me. Okay, so let's go do that. I'm going to close that, go back to my Visual Studio. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to now work around its property. So what is a property? You'll see on the right hand side is the property pane, which we skipped earlier. Now, this property pane is basically a property regarding a specific control. So you can see I've got highlighted label 1, and then my property shows label 1. If I change it to text box, my property will change here to text box. So it gives me the ability to work on that specific control's property. Okay, now what is a property if you're not 100% sure? Your car, let's take for example a car. A car has specific properties, also known as attributes. So your car has a color property. So what is the color of your car? It could be white. Your car has a engine output property. Your car has a number of seats property. Your car has a number has a automatic or manual property. Those are, so it's features, but ultimately it's a property within the car that you have, and that's exactly the same thing with a form or a control. A control has various properties, and very simple to demonstrate that. If I click on label, label has a text property. Now, a different programming languages call them slightly something else, but they all got the same type of result at the end of the day. It might be that they call it a value, it might be they call it a text, or whatever they use at the end of the day. The same result will come when you play the system. So for Visual Studio, they use the property called text. So you can see on the left hand side you got fixed properties, and on the right hand side you have these properties that can be changed. This is the information that you can change. This is the name for that property. So this property, I want a text. So text makes sense to me when I look at it. It means I'm going to change the text of this control. Okay, so I'm going to change the text of this control. Currently the text is label 1, which is what I'm seeing here. So if you see there's label 1 and label 1. I'm going to change this to enter name with a double point there, into name. Okay, so all right, so just want to see, once I've entered it, I've added it, so I clicked on there, I typed it in, I press enter, it created enter name. Now you can see it overlaps, my text box overlapping with my label, so I'll need to adjust my text box a bit to make it fit correctly. Okay, and I'll adjust my button to fit under the text box. All right, so now if I play the system, I'm going to click on start, enter name. That makes more sense to me than label 1. Enter name. Okay, I'm going to enter a name. That makes sense to me. Okay, what this button does doesn't make sense to me yet. I don't know what this button is going to do. So you need to change the text of that button. Okay, it is very important to understand what controls. You can see there's a lot of controls. Every single control that you create in Visual Studio has a unique ID for the project. So you can go like your own ID that you would have to identify yourself. You would have an ID to identify a control. And we have IDs to identify controls because on this one form, let's say I have a form with 10 text boxes. I can't call them all text box 1, text box 2, text box 3. I'm going to confuse myself when I'm programming in the background, and I need to now use the name text box or the surname or the first name or the contact number. I wouldn't know what to do with text box 1. So all controls, if I add a new control on, it gets a name, what Visual Studio gives it. It could be button 1, button 2, button 3, whatever it had last as an index, it will create it automatically. Very important that you do not leave it as button 1 or text box 1. If you're going to use that control in the code, you need to change the name. So like this label here, I'm not going to use label inside my code, so I'm going to leave label as is. I'm not going to give it a name, but because I'm not going to use it in the code section. But text box and button, those things I might use or definitely use, and I would probably want to change the name. So if you click on it, the property, remember previously we worked on the text property. So the text property is not the name. The text property is what the user will see. If I go and I put in there, hello world, click enter, what you'll see all of a sudden is hello world. If I start the program again or press F5, that is what I see. I see hello world, which is fine for the user. It does something there. But if my code, code behind this control, this text box is still called text box 1. So I want to change that name. So very importantly, you can go and change the name. Now there is, and I'll change the name in a second. I just want to explain to you quickly the different types of two views that you get within the properties. There's an A to Z, which is an alphabetical order of this properties. It starts here by accepts return. Name, which is a common thing you use on every control, will always be on top. All right. Then there's a categorized version. Okay. The categorized basically puts different properties into different groups. So everything about appearance, will fall into appearance. Everything to do with behavior of the button will fall in here. And it really depends on what view you like. I prefer the alphabetical. It's what I know. It's what I always used. And I know where my stuff is when I'm in alphabetical order. But again, a lot of programmers use this grouping view, which makes it a bit easier for them to find. So if you had to find name under here, it will be under design. See, there's name. But I'm going to go back to my alphabetical view, and I know name is always third on the list, and I know where to find it. And you can see the name currently is text box 1. I'm going to change that to whatever description makes sense to me on what this control is going to do. Okay, so this control is going to hold a name. All right, so I'm going to say txt name. All right, now I've gone and I've done a bit of an abbreviation, which I use in all my controls so I know what control it is. And I've given it txt name. Name is makes sense to me if I have to program in the background, and txt tells me it's a text box. So it's not a given that you have to use this type of convention when you're calling the controller name. Programmers use different types of naming convention. But it is a good idea to prefix it. So if you're working in a company, you might find they have a standard where they would call their text boxes TX for argument's sake. And that is what you would use as a standard within the business or within the company. And it makes sense to all the other developers around you that they're all using that TX is text box. So in my scenario, I've got TXT and name. It all depends on your own type of personalization when you do programming, but make sure that it does make sense to everybody else. So let me just put that off for 1 sec. All right, so it needs to make sense when you're looking at this control. Some guys prefer camel casing, some guys prefer underscore, so you might find that some programmers like it like that rather. And again, don't worry about it. Pick what makes sense to you. And when you do get to a company, you might find that you have to change your standard slightly to adjust to what their standard is. But it really needs to just make sense to you. So I've gone text box, I've given it a name. I'm going to do the button as well. I'm going to give the button a name as well. btn save. That's what this button action will be for me. It will be a save. I haven't changed the text property of it yet, so I'm going to go down and do the text property. And I'm going to call this save. So you'll see that saves changes there. And I'm going to make my form smaller again. Again, I'm going to take out this text out of hello world. I'm going to take it out. I don't need that. So if you look, the two properties we've covered now is text and name. Okay, very simple properties. There's a whole lot of properties. I'm going to play with one or two more before we close off with this video, just so you can see it. And then in our next video, we'll go in a bit more detail into the properties. Okay, so if I click on the button, the text box here, I'm going to go to some of its properties now just to show you one or two things. Before we do it, let's play the system. See what we've got. So if I'm a user now, enter name, save, makes sense to me. It doesn't say button 1, it doesn't say label 1. It really makes sense to me as to basically what to do. I'm going to enter a name and I'm going to click on the save button. That makes sense. You need to, obviously, when you're building a form for a user, don't just slap something together. You need to build something that makes sense for the user. You're not the person who's going to be using it. The user will be using it, and that user will get very frustrated very quickly if something is not doing what it's supposed to be doing, or it doesn't make sense to them, and they'll just stop using the system. So make sure you build it so that it's friendly, user-friendly, and usable at the end of the day by the user. Okay, so I'm going to close that again. We've checked our system. We're fairly happy with what we've got here. Now I'm going to show you one or two more properties that you can see. So if you remember when I played and I typed in Joe, that is how it looks like. Now I want this to be in bold. When the user types it, it must be bold. So I'm going to close it. I'm going to change the property. Go there, click on the text box, and it will be under the font property. If I drop this font down, there's some information there, and I'm going to look for the bold. Okay, bold, I made it true. You can see it's got two options, true or false. So as you'll see, some properties has options that you pre-select or select. Some properties you type in, like the name in the text box, depending on what type of property you're dealing with. All right, I'm going to play it again, and I'm going to now go and type in Joe again, and you'll see all of a sudden it is in bold. So that property, font property, or the bold one, we changed, and we made our text box font bold. Right now, I'll show you another property, and we're going to work with the back color property. I want my text box to have a lightish color. So there's obviously various things you can play around with. If I drop down on back color and I drop down this window here, there's custom, which a whole lot of colors. There's web with different various colors, and there's system colors, which is your Windows colors that it comes up by default. So I'm going to go into web and I'm going to pick something like blue. What you will see all of a sudden is that your text box has now become light blue. Okay, and again, I'm going to play that. And now I type in Joe, and I've got a bold font with a back color text box of light blue. And so I've changed the property on that. I've changed the font property, the bold. I've changed the label. I've changed the name, and I've changed the text property. I've changed the name property and text property. So I've played around with very few properties, but you can see what I've accomplished by changing a few of the properties around. So I'm going to stop that again. Okay, I'm going to leave it on light blue, and there's a whole lot of different types of properties that you can play with. I'm not going to run through all of them. The other one that I'm going to just look at is the enable property. So if I disable the control, all right, and I play the system, remember you got to play the system to see the property in action. In some instances, some of them will be done in design. So like the back color, if I change it in design, it changes the color, but I can't see the font necessarily unless I type something in, and I can't necessarily see the enable unless I do something. So if you look at this now, I can't type in it, it's disabled, and that's because the enabled property that we had here is now true. Okay, so if I stop that, go back to my property, make it false, and start again, I will then oh, sorry, I disabled the label. My mistake. So I'm going to go back, select both controls, and just enable them. Okay, that is another thing that is nice and handy. If you see what I did there, I selected two controls in one, and .NET will then say, okay, these two controls, they have the same, these are the properties that it's the same for them, and you can change them in one go instead of taking each control one by one. So for this one, I've taken both these controls, selected them by just dragging my mouse, selecting them, and I changed the enabled to true. If I play it now, what have I done? Let me double check what I've done here. Enabled. Sorry, I'm just trying to see what I've done. That's interesting. So as if the properties are not changing. Let's just change that to false. And stop it again. Oh, you know what I've done? I've made the form false. I didn't see that. Okay, so a stupid mistake there from my side. So the whole form, remember this is the form, I've selected that and I made that false, and which means all the controls will be false. So I'm going to go back and make it true, double check if everything else is true. Sorry about that, and then click start. Now I should have be back to my Joe font bold, and you can play around with these properties. So before we start the next video, it's a good idea to do what I've done now. Play around with the properties. You can always just undo it if you're not sure. Some of the properties make sense, some of them don't make much sense, won't make much sense to you. Play around with the ones that do make sense to you. If I click on the text box, the font one should make sense. 4 color is the text color. So if I change it to a red and I play my system, the Joe will be bold and red. So play around with those type of properties, add more controls, so that you can understand more or less how to add them, drag them, delete them, and so on. Don't have to understand what each control does. That is something I'll deal with in later videos, but for now, just play around with it. Okay, so this comes to basically the conclusion of this introduction to the environment. It is a lot that's going on, but don't be overwhelmed by it. The more you practice it, the more you do things within the environment, the easier it will get. Learn your shortcuts. It will make your life a lot easier. Understand how to drag controls, how to add them. Understand that if your system is not building, that there's a possibility that you need to look at your error list or your output window. Just understand where those things are. Understand how your Solution Explorer works. So add more forms and add items with it, play around with it. It doesn't matter. If you break it, you break it, you start again. Just get going with it, and the more you practice, the easier the process will get. Before we hit the next video, try and play around with as much of the properties as you can with the different controls. We only covered 3 controls now. So play around with those 3 controls, play around with their properties. The button has different properties. It's got background color as well. It's got different styles, fonts, and so on. Play around with that just to get a feel for how certain things work within the environment. You can obviously change the sizes. If you see I change sizes, I change the sizes there in the property. So have a look at that, play around with it, and I hope to see you guys on the next video. Thanks.